Let's talk about the birthright citizenship ruling, which to me, as a layman, an average American citizen, I thought would be a no-brainer, 9-0 decision.
Right. Yeah.
But instead, it's not. Can you please explain what this was about and what the decision tells the American people?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Bobby. This is a no-brainer. The Constitution says that if you're born in this country, you're a citizen of this country. And that has been challenged by Donald Trump because he doesn't like the fact that people get citizenship automatically. He would prefer to be able to reserve citizenship for people he believes are deserving. And that's not what the Constitution says. So it should be very clear. We've got all these conservative justices who consider themselves what is called originalists. So they want the Constitution to retain its original meaning, and the originalist version of it after the 14th Amendment was passed is that if you're born here, you are a citizen automatically. So that should be a no-brainer, but it wasn't. There are a number of conservative justices on the court who believe that they can reinterpret the Constitution to mean that if you're the child of an immigrant who's born here, you're not automatically a citizen. This is obviously motivated by partisan political ideology and not by a faithful interpretation of the Constitution, which is really concerning because the Supreme Court, at least in theory, is supposed to be above the fray of politics. It is clear right now that it is not, and that political ideology is influencing the decisions that they're making. Fortunately, we just barely had a majority of justices who did not want to interpret the Constitution in a way that is totally inconsistent with what it actually says. But it's really pretty shocking that it's not a 9-0 decision.
Right. Was it Alito who basically talked about jurisdiction with this or intent? I don't know how one says my intent was not to be born a citizen or was to be born a citizen. It was unbelievable. I stopped reading his opinion because I was like, wait, what? I had to suspend my willing suspicion of disbelief, I guess. But this seemed to be a theme throughout these rulings that were handed down. So we go from birthright citizenship to mail-in ballots, you know, the validity there. I think your original premise is right. There's a political overtone to these decisions. Can you explain what happened with that case and why does it matter?
Yeah, so this is another example of it should have been a no-brainer. It should have been a 9-0 decision. I believe this one was 5-4, or maybe it was 6-3.
Yep, 5-4.
Okay, so this is a decision about whether the state of Alabama can count ballots 5 days after election day, mail-in ballots. Can they continue to count those ballots under state law for 5 days? And that's what the state law says. You've got 5 days from the date of election day to continue counting ballots as long as the ballot has been cast and postmarked by the day of the election. Federal law requires that elections happen on a certain day, but federal law does not require that you get all of the ballots from mail-ins returned on election day. And the Constitution specifically says that it is up to states to make their own laws where there's no governing federal law about how to conduct their elections. States have different rules and regulations about mail-in ballots. Mostly people like mail-in ballots because it makes it easier to vote. It makes it easier to exercise your right under the Constitution to cast a vote and make your voice heard in our democracy. So mail-in ballots have become widely accepted as valid. Donald Trump doesn't like mail-in ballots, and some conservative members of the Supreme Court apparently don't either. And this decision just, barely held that the states have the right to make their own laws. And it upheld this law that allows ballots to be counted after the election. There are people who will tell you that from a policy perspective, it's not good policy if we don't have the results of the election on election day. And that's a legitimate argument to make. But what's not legitimate is to say that when the state has a law in place, you can just change it at the last minute and really interfere with people's ability to vote. The Constitution says that states can make these laws, and they did so here. And that law, fortunately, was upheld by the Supreme Court. There could be a law of Congress that changes this in the future. Congress could say states are no longer allowed to count mail-in ballots after election day. That's something that Congress would probably have the power to do under the Constitution. But right now, that's not the law, and the Supreme Court upheld the state law because there's no congressional law that says differently.
Can you clarify something? Because I have a couple of follow-ups on this. Again, I studied political science. It was my understanding with the Constitution, my interpretation, that federal law, the federal level of government is not supposed to run elections. That is supposed to be a state's rights, you know that term, a state's right issue as far as how they run their election. Is it me? Am I crazy? Or is Donald Trump in his current administration trying to reach in and influence basically elections that should be held at the state level as far as how they're ran? Is that a bridge too far? Am I wrong or exaggerating? Because that seems to be the thing happening here.
He absolutely is trying to do that. So you're absolutely right that the states primarily have the authority under the Constitution to make rules related to elections. There are some limited federal laws as well, and the federal government can make some laws with respect to elections, including, like I mentioned, setting a national election day for the general election. But as far as state elections are concerned, they're up to the states to decide how to conduct them. And when the president suddenly says you can't do this or you can do that, it creates some real problems because states have local jurisdictions throughout them that are responsible for administering elections, even in the most remote places. It's not like a centralized, like a state has one election office. So if you've got the president saying, we're going to require XYZ changes on election day, like we're going to require voter ID or this or that, the other thing, that is something that would require a whole lot of lead time for a state to be able to implement it, to make sure that it doesn't disenfranchise everybody, to make sure that election workers in all areas of the state are able to be trained in what the rules are so that they can administer elections according to law on election day. Like the fact that we're talking about changes to elections now with midterms coming up in a few months in November, it's really, we shouldn't even be talking about it. There is no time to have states redo their election procedures. Donald Trump is still advocating for this legislation called the SAVE Act, which would require proof of citizenship to vote. If we were to implement that now, even if it were legal to do that, it would be a disaster to try to get that implemented in an orderly fashion and make sure that our elections are free and fair in November. And that's exactly the point. Donald Trump is trying to make changes that will sow chaos into the election so that if the results are not something that he likes, he will have some basis to say that the elections were rigged and they weren't fair, and he'll be challenging the results if they don't go his way.
I think you nailed it. One of the things that's really bothering me specifically about this case is you have a lot of military members active duty who vote mail-in ballot. And they, given what's happening with Iran and areas of the world where specifically the mail service via Pete Hegseth has been shut down, you're now telling me that those people who used to be me will not be able to participate in their election. That is mind-blowing. That's not America first. That's literally the ones that you put in harm's way suffering the consequences of this action. It's mind-blowing.